War is supposed to be dangerous, but usually the danger comes from the enemy. Tonight, we're looking at 10 moments in military history where the enemy didn't have to do anything, because someone on the battlefield decided to defeat themselves first. These aren't heroic last stands. They aren't tragic accidents in combat. These are the moments when trained soldiers, surrounded by weapons, explosives, artillery, and machines specifically designed to destroy things, manage to forget one small detail. Those things are also extremely good at destroying the people using them. Grenades used as teaching tools, artillery shells treated like souvenirs, and experiments in bravery that physics was never going to approve. Every army in history has stories like these. Stories that commanders don't usually put in textbooks, because sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is confidence. Let's begin. 1. The grenade lesson nobody forgot. Military training is designed to teach soldiers how to survive. Unfortunately, sometimes the instructor becomes the lesson. This story comes from a training field where a group of new recruits were learning the basics of grenade safety. Their instructor was a veteran, the kind of man who had handled explosives hundreds of times and believed he understood them better than anyone else in the room. To him, grenades weren't terrifying. They were tools, simple tools. He held one up for the class to see. This, he explained confidently, is completely safe if you know what you're doing. That sentence has historically been responsible for a shocking number of disasters. The recruits watched closely as he demonstrated each step. Pull the pin. Hold the lever. Count the seconds. Throw. Standard procedure. Except this time, he wanted to make a point. Instead of just explaining the process, he decided to show them exactly how much control a trained soldier had over the weapon. He pulled the pin. The metal ring snapped free with a sharp click. Then he kept talking, explaining, gesturing, with the grenade still in his hand, while the recruits stared at the small metal object that was now actively counting down. The problem with grenades is that they operate on a very strict schedule. Once the lever releases, the fuse begins burning, and it does not pause for lectures. At some point during his explanation, the instructor made a very small mistake. He relaxed his grip, just slightly. The lever popped free. For half a second, the entire training field froze. The instructor realized what had happened at the exact same moment the recruits did. Suddenly, the confident lecturer turned into a frantic scramble. He attempted to throw the grenade, but panic has a funny way of destroying fine motor skills. Instead of flying safely downrange, the grenade slipped from his hand and dropped directly onto the ground beside him. The recruits dove for cover. Unfortunately, the instructor was standing exactly where the grenade had landed. A few seconds later, the demonstration reached its final step. The explosion echoed across the training range. When the smoke cleared, the recruits had learned an extremely memorable lesson about explosive safety, not from the manual, but from the man who had been explaining how safe grenades were just moments earlier. It remains one of the most effective training demonstrations ever recorded, just not the one he intended. 2. The soldier who looked inside a loaded cannon. Curiosity is one of the most powerful forces in human history. It has led to incredible discoveries, groundbreaking inventions, and the entire scientific revolution. It has also occasionally led someone to look directly into the barrel of a loaded cannon. This particular story dates back to the era of black powder artillery, when cannons were the dominant weapons of war. These machines were brutally simple: a metal tube, a charge of gunpowder, a heavy iron ball, and an ignition source. Load it, aim it, fire it. And anything in front of that cannon, enemy soldiers, walls, trees, buildings, would simply stop existing. Artillery crews were trained carefully because these weapons were just as dangerous to operate as they were to face in battle. A single mistake during loading could turn the cannon itself into a bomb. Which brings us to one soldier who became extremely curious about a cannon that had just misfired. During a training exercise, an artillery crew had attempted to fire a cannon. The gunpowder charge had been lit, but nothing happened. No explosion, no recoil, no cannonball flying across the field, just silence. In artillery terms, this is known as a misfire, and it is one of the most dangerous situations possible, because a misfire usually means one of two things. Either the cannon failed to ignite properly, or it's about to ignite late. Artillery crews are specifically trained to treat misfires with extreme caution. The standard procedure is simple. You wait. A long time. Sometimes several minutes, because the powder inside the cannon might still ignite unexpectedly. But the soldier in this story wasn't thinking about delayed ignition. He was thinking about answers. Why didn't it fire? Was the powder bad? Was the cannon empty? Did something block the barrel? He decided there was one very straightforward way to find out. He walked up to the cannon and leaned forward to look inside the barrel. Now, from his perspective, this probably seemed reasonable. If the cannon hadn't fired yet, clearly something must be wrong. What he didn't realize was that the fuse had simply burned slower than expected. At the exact moment he leaned in close enough to see the dark interior of the barrel, the powder charge ignited. The cannon fired exactly as it was designed to. A thunderous explosion erupted from the muzzle. The cannonball launched forward with devastating force. And unfortunately, the soldier investigating the barrel was positioned directly in the path of the blast. Witnesses later described the moment as happening so quickly that it barely registered before it was over. The cannon had simply finished doing its job. The tragic irony is that the weapon itself had not malfunctioned at all. It worked perfectly. It was just operating on its own schedule. Artillery crews across history have repeated the same lesson again and again. If a cannon fails to fire, you do not investigate by looking into the barrel, because if the cannon decides to fire a moment later, you will be the last thing it ever sees. 3. The soldier who tried to catch a falling mortar shell. Military training teaches many useful skills. How to shoot accurately, how to move under fire, how to operate complex weapons without accidentally removing yourself from the census. One thing it does not teach is how to catch a mortar shell, because the correct technique for dealing with a falling mortar shell is extremely simple. You run away, as fast as possible. Unfortunately, one soldier decided to improvise. This story comes from a mortar training exercise where a small team of soldiers were practicing indirect fire. Mortars are wonderfully efficient military tools. Drop a shell into the tube, gravity does the rest, and a few seconds later something unpleasant happens several hundred meters away. Simple, elegant, extremely loud. But like most military equipment, mortars rely on one very important rule. The shell must leave the tube. During this particular training exercise, one mortar round behaved strangely. The soldier dropped the shell into the tube. Normally, you hear a satisfying metallic clink as the firing pin strikes the primer, followed immediately by a deep thump as the shell launches into the sky. Except this time, nothing happened. No thump, no launch. Just silence. Which meant the round was stuck. Now, military protocol for a stuck mortar round is very clear and very boring. You step back, you wait. You call someone who actually knows what they're doing, because the shell might still detonate at any moment. But our soldier had a different idea. Instead of treating the mortar like a loaded explosive device, he treated it like a mildly annoying vending machine. Maybe it just needed a little encouragement. He leaned over the tube to see what was going on. At that exact moment, gravity and the firing pin finally completed their long-delayed conversation. The shell fired. But because the soldier was leaning over the tube, the mortar round didn't launch into the sky. Instead, it bounced. Straight upward. About a meter. Then it started falling back down. And this is where things truly became impressive. Because instead of running away from the falling explosive, the response evolution has been carefully installing into human brains for millions of years, the soldier decided to catch it. Perhaps he thought he could toss it aside. Perhaps he thought he could save the day. Perhaps he simply panicked, and his brain temporarily forgot the basic rules of explosive physics. Whatever the reason, he reached out his hands and grabbed the descending mortar shell. For a brief moment, he succeeded. He actually caught it, which is technically an incredible athletic achievement. Unfortunately, mortar shells are not baseballs. They contain a fuse designed to detonate a few seconds after launch, and by the time he caught the shell, those seconds were already gone. Witnesses later described the explosion as immediate. The mortar round completed its mission exactly where it had been caught. which officially makes this one of the very few recorded examples in military history of someone successfully catching a live explosive projectile. A remarkable demonstration of reflexes, terrible demonstration of judgment, and a powerful reminder that in warfare, and in life, sometimes the correct move is simply, do not try to catch the bomb. 4. The bulletproof helmet demonstration. Every army in the world eventually produces one soldier who desperately wants to prove something. Usually bravery, sometimes toughness, and occasionally, a complete misunderstanding of how bullets work. This story begins in a military camp where a group of soldiers were arguing about equipment, something soldiers have been doing since the invention of equipment. Helmets were the topic of the day. Modern military helmets are designed to stop shrapnel, debris, and occasionally certain low-energy impacts. They are very good at preventing soldiers from being killed by random fragments flying through the air. What they are not designed for is being used as targets. Unfortunately, one soldier had developed a theory. According to him, the helmet was basically bulletproof. He had heard somewhere that it could stop a projectile, maybe shrapnel, maybe something else. But in his mind, the conclusion was simple. Helmet equals bulletproof. His friends were skeptical, which, again, is the correct response when someone announces a theory that sounds like it was invented during a late-night conversation with alcohol involved. One of the other soldiers pointed out the obvious. Yeah, it might stop fragments, he said, but it won't stop a direct shot. Now at this point, a reasonable person might say something like, "You're probably right." But reasonable people rarely become the main character in Darwin Award stories. Instead, our hero decided to prove his point. He picked up the helmet and placed it on his own head. Then he turned to his friend and asked him to shoot it. Now imagine being the friend in this situation. You're standing there holding a loaded rifle, while a man in front of you is confidently explaining that the helmet he is wearing will definitely stop the bullet you are about to fire. There are several ways this conversation could end. The best option would be, absolutely not. The second best option would be, I'm leaving. Unfortunately, the option chosen was, okay. The shooter stepped back, aimed carefully, and fired. The sound echoed across the training area like every terrible decision in history announcing its arrival. The helmet did exactly what physics predicted it would do, which is to say, not very much. Military helmets are strong. They are excellent protection against fragments and glancing blows. But a direct rifle round at close range is a completely different conversation. The bullet passed through the helmet with very little resistance and continued exactly where the laws of momentum expected it to go. The demonstration was extremely educational. It proved beyond any doubt that the helmet was not bulletproof. It also proved that sometimes the biggest danger on a military base is not the enemy. It's the moment someone says, "Trust me, this will work." 5. The souvenir that definitely should have stayed on the battlefield. War zones produce many strange habits. Soldiers collect patches, helmets, spent bullet casings, and sometimes they collect things that are still very much designed to explode. During one conflict in the 20th century, a group of soldiers were clearing an area that had recently been shelled by artillery. The ground was littered with debris from the barrage, fragments of metal, burned-out equipment, and occasionally something far more dangerous, unexploded shells. These are known in military terms as UXO, unexploded ordnance. They are exactly what they sound like, artillery rounds that failed to detonate when they landed, and they are one of the most dangerous things left behind after a battle. Because even though they didn't explode the first time, they are still very much capable of exploding later. Bomb disposal units exist specifically to deal with these things, and their job usually begins with a simple instruction: do not touch the shell. Unfortunately, one soldier decided to ignore that advice. While searching through the area, he spotted an artillery shell lying partially buried in the dirt. It looked intact, clean, almost impressive. To him, it didn't look like a bomb. It looked like a souvenir. And soldiers love souvenirs. Something to take home. Something to show friends. A little reminder of where you've been. He dug the shell out of the ground and carried it back with him. According to witnesses, he was even a little proud of the find. Not everyone gets to bring home a real artillery round. There was just one small detail he hadn't considered. Artillery shells are not decorative objects. They are steel containers filled with high explosives and a fuse designed to detonate under specific conditions. And the thing about explosives is that they do not particularly care whether they are on a battlefield or in someone's living room. When the soldier returned to camp, curiosity got the better of him. He wanted to see what was inside, so he began examining the shell, turning it over, looking at the fuse, trying to figure out how the mechanism worked. And eventually, like countless curious people before him, he decided the fastest way to understand something mechanical was to hit it with a tool. Historians disagree about whether he used a hammer, a rock, or some other improvised instrument, but they all agree on what happened next. The shell detonated. Artillery explosives are designed to destroy buildings, vehicles, and groups of soldiers. They are extremely good at this job. The explosion destroyed the shell, the table it was resting on, and, unfortunately, the man who had been trying to figure out how it worked. In the aftermath, the lesson became part of military folklore. When soldiers are told not to pick up unexploded ordnance, it's not because the army wants to ruin someone's souvenir collection. It's because unexploded shells are not souvenirs. They're bombs that simply haven't finished their conversation with gravity yet. And if you start hitting them with tools, they will happily finish that conversation right where you're standing. 6. The soldier who wanted to see if the landmine was real. Landmines are one of the simplest and most brutally effective weapons ever invented. They don't require training, they don't require aiming, and they definitely don't require supervision. All they need is one thing: pressure. Step on them, and the conversation ends immediately. Because of this, soldiers are trained very early on to treat landmines with absolute respect. If you see one, you mark it. If you suspect one, you avoid it. If you're not trained to deal with it, you stay very far away. Unfortunately, one soldier decided that the best way to confirm whether something was a landmine was to step on it. The story comes from a patrol unit moving through a recently contested area. The ground had been churned up by vehicles and artillery, and everyone knew that the enemy had been planting mines along the route, which meant the soldiers were moving slowly and carefully, watching every step. At one point, a soldier spotted something unusual in the dirt ahead. A small, round metal object partially buried in the soil. It looked suspicious. It looked exactly like the kind of thing soldiers are trained to avoid. So naturally, the group stopped. One soldier pointed at it. "Is that a mine?" someone asked. Now at this point, the correct response is very simple. Yes, probably. Then everyone backs away slowly while someone trained in explosives disposal handles the situation. But the soldier closest to the object had a different plan. He squatted down and examined it, turned his head slightly, looked at the others, and said something along the lines of, "I don't think it's real." Those words have historically been followed by extremely loud sounds. His reasoning seemed logical to him. The mine looked old. Maybe it had been abandoned. Maybe it was broken. Maybe it was just an empty casing left behind. There was only one way to be sure. He placed his boot directly on top of it. Now, to be fair, there is a brief moment when someone steps on a pressure mine where nothing happens. A fraction of a second, just long enough for the person to think, "See, I told you." That moment happened here. For about half a second, the soldier stood there proudly with his boot on the device. Then the mine completed the job it had been waiting to do since the day it was buried. The explosion was immediate. Landmines are designed specifically to destroy the legs of whoever triggers them. It's a grim but effective design that has been used in wars for decades. The blast threw dirt, metal fragments, and everything else nearby into the air. The patrol unit behind him dove for cover, stunned by how quickly curiosity had turned into catastrophe. Later reports from the unit described the moment with a mix of disbelief and frustration, because every single soldier there knew the rule. Do not touch suspicious objects. Do not investigate mines. And under absolutely no circumstances should you test them with your own foot. But the soldier had wanted proof. He wanted certainty. And unfortunately, landmines are extremely good at providing that. 7. The soldier who tried to throw back a grenade like it was baseball practice. Grenades are one of the few weapons in war that come with a very simple rule. When one lands near you, you do not debate it. You move fast. Because grenades are designed with a built-in delay fuse, usually about 4 to 5 seconds. That short pause exists for one reason: to give the person who threw it enough time to take cover before it explodes. It does not exist so the target can examine the situation like a chess problem. But in one particular battlefield incident, a soldier decided he had another option. He was going to throw it back. The story comes from a chaotic firefight during the Second World War. Two groups of soldiers were exchanging gunfire across a ruined position, the kind of confused battlefield where visibility is poor, nerves are high, and decisions are made in fractions of seconds. At some point during the fight, an enemy soldier lobbed a grenade toward a group of defenders. The small metal cylinder landed in the dirt just a few feet away from them. The correct response in this situation is immediate. You dive for cover. But one soldier saw the grenade hit the ground and had a different idea. Instead of running, he lunged toward it. Somewhere in his mind, he probably imagined the perfect, heroic moment. Grab the grenade, hurl it back, save the day. Maybe even look impressive while doing it. The kind of move that works beautifully in movies. Unfortunately, real grenades do not follow cinematic timing. He scooped the grenade off the ground. Now here is the problem. Grenades do not explode exactly on a predictable countdown like a microwave timer. The fuse burns for a roughly estimated amount of time, and that time starts the moment the safety lever pops free. Which means, by the time the grenade lands near you, most of that countdown is already gone. The soldier grabbed the grenade. He pulled his arm back. He began the throwing motion, and the grenade detonated before the throw was finished. Witnesses later described a blinding flash and a sharp, violent blast at exactly the moment he tried to release it. The grenade never made it back to the enemy. It barely made it out of his hand. The rest of the soldiers in the position dove for cover, stunned by how quickly an attempt at heroism had turned into a textbook lesson in explosive timing. Military training manuals often reference this exact scenario, because trying to throw a grenade back sounds brave, but it is almost always a terrible idea. You do not know how long the fuse has been burning. You do not know how much time is left. And explosives have a deeply inconvenient habit of ending discussions exactly when they feel like it. The soldier had attempted to turn a grenade into a game of catch. The grenade disagreed. Violently. 8. The soldier who used a tank shell as a campfire stool. War zones are full of strange objects. Broken vehicles, spent ammunition, unexploded ordnance. Most soldiers quickly learn a simple survival rule. If it looks like a bomb, don't sit on it. But as history repeatedly proves, common sense is not evenly distributed. This particular incident happened during a quiet period between engagements. A small group of soldiers had set up a temporary camp after a long day of movement through contested territory. The night was cold. The kind of cold that creeps into your bones after hours in the field. So like soldiers have done in every war since humans discovered fire, they built a small campfire to stay warm. Boots off, rations heating, everyone finally relaxing for a moment. One of the soldiers wandered around the nearby area looking for something to sit on. Logs were scarce. The ground was muddy. Standing all night wasn't appealing. Then he found something perfect. A large metal cylinder lying partly buried near the fire. Heavy, solid, about the right height to use as a stool. To anyone familiar with military hardware, it was instantly recognizable. It was a tank shell. More specifically, an unexploded, high-explosive round that had somehow failed to detonate earlier in the conflict. Now, unexploded shells are extremely dangerous. Even years later, they can still detonate if disturbed, damaged, or heated. Which brings us to the truly unfortunate detail of this situation. The soldier dragged the shell closer to the fire because it made a better seat there. He planted it firmly in the ground, sat down on top of it, and warmed his hands over the flames, like a man who had just solved a minor furniture problem. His friends reportedly noticed the object and asked what he was sitting on. He shrugged. Just some piece of metal. And technically, that was correct. It was just a piece of metal. A piece of metal filled with high explosives. For a while, nothing happened, which probably made him feel very smart. The fire crackled, The soldiers talked. Someone passed around cigarettes, and the metal shell slowly began absorbing heat from the nearby flames. Explosives are surprisingly stable under normal conditions, but heat changes things. Heat creates pressure. Pressure creates instability. And eventually, the shell decided it had been sitting next to that fire long enough. The explosion was immediate and violent. Tank shells are designed to destroy armored vehicles. When one detonates outside of a tank barrel, the results are still extremely unpleasant. The blast tore through the campfire area, scattering debris, dirt, and burning wood in every direction. The soldiers nearby were thrown to the ground by the shockwave. When the dust settled, the campfire was gone. So was the stool. And so was the soldier who had decided unexploded ordnance made comfortable seating. In the aftermath, the story spread quickly through the unit, not as a heroic tale, not even as a tragic battlefield loss, but as a brutal reminder of one simple rule that soldiers learn the hard way. If something on a battlefield looks like a bomb, it probably is. And if you ever find yourself warming your hands over a fire while sitting on it, you have made several extremely poor life decisions in rapid succession. 9. The officer who looked down the cannon to check if it was loaded. Artillery is one of humanity's oldest and most reliable ways of turning distant problems into explosions. Cannons, mortars, and large-caliber guns all follow the same basic principle. Put explosive force behind a metal object, point it somewhere, and physics does the rest. Because of this, artillery crews are trained with a very strict set of safety procedures. You never stand in front of the barrel. You never stand behind the recoil path. And most importantly, you never look down the barrel of a weapon. Unfortunately, during one historical military incident, an officer decided to perform a quick visual inspection in the worst way possible. The setting was an artillery position preparing equipment for use. The crew had been working with one of their field guns earlier in the day, and there had been some confusion about whether the weapon had already been fired or if a round was still inside. Normally, this question is resolved through procedure. You check the firing log, you verify with the crew, and if there's uncertainty, you treat the weapon as loaded. But the officer supervising the operation believed there was a faster solution. He would simply look. To him, it probably seemed perfectly logical. If the cannon was empty, he would see daylight through the barrel. If there was a round inside, he would see, well, a round inside. Problem solved. So he walked over to the front of the artillery piece, bent slightly forward, and leaned down to peer directly into the dark opening of the cannon barrel. Now at this exact moment, somewhere behind him, one of the crew members was preparing the weapon. Accounts differ slightly on what happened next. In some versions, a soldier believed the gun was ready and began the firing procedure. In others, someone was clearing the mechanism and accidentally triggered the firing pin. But all versions agree on one unfortunate detail. The cannon fired. Artillery guns produce an enormous blast even when the projectile has already left the barrel. The sudden explosion of propellant inside the gun creates a massive pressure wave and a violent burst of gas out the front of the barrel. And the officer happened to have his face positioned exactly where that blast would exit. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The blast threw him backward and ended the inspection in the most definitive way possible. The artillery crew stood in stunned silence, because what had just happened was not the result